"Take your hand off my mother's scarf." The little girl's voice was quiet, but the entire room heard it. 8-year-old Sophia Bell stood in the middle of the Moretti mansion's grand winter reception hall. Her small hand wrapped around the edge of her mother's coat as if she could protect her from 100 watching eyes. The room had been filled with soft music, expensive perfume, and conversations between powerful people who believed they understood exactly where everyone belonged. Until that moment. Until a simple scarf fell onto the cold marble floor. Elena Brooks had spent years learning how to disappear inside the Moretti mansion. She moved quietly, carried trays carefully, and never interrupted conversations that were not meant for her. To most guests, she was just another employee in a black uniform standing near the walls. Someone useful but unseen. Someone people looked through instead of looking at. But Victoria Valenti had always noticed her. Not because Elena mattered to her. Because Elena bothered her. Victoria stood near the center of the room wearing a designer gown and a perfect smile, the kind of smile that appeared in charity magazines and social events across the city. "I'm only asking a simple question," Victoria said calmly. "Why does someone who works inside this home keep hiding something from the people who live here?" Elena lowered her eyes. "Miss Valenti, it is personal." That answer seemed to make Victoria's smile disappear for half a second. Then it returned. Personal things become everyone's concern when they happen inside this family's home. Several guests looked away. Some pretended not to notice. Others watched with quiet curiosity. Elena reached for the scarf around her neck, but before she could adjust it, Victoria stepped closer. "If there is nothing wrong, there is nothing to hide." The next second, the scarf was pulled away. It landed on the floor between them. The room became silent, not because of the scarf, because of what it revealed. A faded burn mark crossed Elena's shoulder, an old injury she had spent years keeping covered beneath fabric and careful clothing. For a moment, nobody spoke. Then Sophia moved. She stepped between her mother and the room full of strangers. She was only 8 years old. She was not strong enough to fight anyone. She was not old enough to understand every secret adults carried. But she understood one thing. Her mother looked ashamed of something that was never her fault. Sophia picked up the scarf from the floor and held it out to Elena. "Mom," she whispered, "you don't have to hide it from me." Elena's eyes filled with emotion, but she quickly looked away. "Sophia, sweetheart, go stand by the table." The little girl shook her head. "No. They're looking at you like you did something wrong." That sentence landed harder than anyone expected. Even Alessandro Moretti, the man standing at the far end of the room, stopped moving. Alessandro was used to controlling rooms without raising his voice. At 42 years old, he had built an empire through patience, discipline, and a reputation that made people choose their words carefully around him. But now he was not watching Victoria. He was not watching the guests. He was looking at Elena's shoulder, at the shape of the old scar, at the memory that had been buried beneath 20 years of silence. His fingers tightened around the silver watch on his wrist, a watch that had belonged to his father, a watch he had worn on the night everything changed, the night of the fire, the night he survived when he should not have. Alessandro took one slow step forward. Nobody noticed the fear hidden behind his calm expression. Nobody except Sophia. The little girl looked up at him and quietly said, "You know that mark, don't you?" The room froze. Victoria turned toward Alessandro, suddenly less confident. "Alex?" she asked, but he did not answer her, because for the first time in 20 years, Alessandro Moretti was no longer looking at a maid. He was looking at the only person who might know the truth about the night he lost everything. And he had one question he could not ignore. How could the woman standing in front of him as a servant be connected to the person who saved his life? Alessandro did not take the bracelet from Sophia right away. He looked at it as if touching it too soon might turn a forgotten memory into something he could no longer control. The broken charm was blackened around the edges, but beneath the damage, a faint raised letter remained. Not enough for the guests to notice. Enough for a man who had grown up around the Moretti crest to stop breathing for one quiet second. Victoria stepped closer, her voice soft and careful. Alex, this is becoming uncomfortable for everyone. The child is upset. Elena is embarrassed. Let us not make it worse. Alessandro finally lifted his eyes. Uncomfortable is not the same as untrue. The room went still again. Elena lowered her face, but Sofia kept watching Alessandro with the serious patience of a child, who had already learned that adults often needed more time than children did to admit what was obvious. Alessandro turned to one of the older house staff near the doorway. Mrs. Keller, take the guests into the dining room. Coffee, dessert, anything they want. Victoria smiled with relief, but it vanished when Alessandro added, Elena stays. Sofia stays. The guests began moving slowly, whispering behind lowered voices, pretending they were not staring. Sofia held the bracelet close to her chest, and Elena kept the scarf pressed against her shoulder. When the room emptied, the mansion seemed colder. The fire in the wide stone fireplace made a soft crackling sound, and Elena flinched so quickly most people would have missed it. Alessandro did not. He also noticed how she did not stand near the tall glass doors that opened toward the east terrace. She kept herself several feet away from them, as if the glass itself remembered something she wished it would forget. Sofia noticed him watching. Mom does not like that side of the house, she said quietly. Elena turned toward her. Sofia. The little girl looked sorry, but she did not take it back. You told me never to wait by the east windows, even in other houses. Alessandro slowly turned toward the east side of the room. Behind those windows, snow dusted the dark hedges and the stone path leading toward the old wing of the property, a section no one used except for storage. Why would she say that? He asked. Sofia hugged the bracelet tighter. Because windows break. When people panic. Elena closed her eyes. Victoria made a small sound, almost a laugh, but it did not fit the room. Children hear one dramatic sentence and build a whole mystery from it. Alessandro looked at her. Then why did you react before she finished? Victoria's expression did not change, but her shoulders did. A tiny tightening, gone almost instantly. Alessandro saw it. He had built a life around noticing the inch before a lie became a mistake. He walked toward the side corridor that led to the old storage wing. Marco, he said without turning. His cousin, who had been silent near the door, stepped forward. Open the East Archive. Victoria's head turned sharply. The archive? Alex, that room has not been used in years. Then nobody should mind. The old archive smelled like dust, paper, and locked time. Boxes lined the shelves, marked with dates, invoices, estate repairs, insurance files, family property maps. Sofia stayed beside her mother, small enough to look lost among the tall cabinets, but alert enough to see her mother stop at one shelf before anyone said anything. Alessandro followed Elena's eyes. He pulled down a long cardboard tube sealed with old tape. On the outside, in faded black marker, were the words, Moretti Estate Emergency Exit Plan. Victoria took one step back. Alessandro broke the seal and unrolled the paper across a wooden table. The plan showed the old mansion before renovations, including staircases that no longer existed and corridors sealed after the fire. Near the east wing, one narrow service passage had been circled by hand. The ink was old. The line was uneven. At the edge of the mark were two words written in careful letters. Only way. Sofia looked up at her mother. That looks like your writing. Elena did not answer. Alessandro stared at the note, then at Elena's face. How would a maid who started working here 6 months ago know the only safe exit in a house that burned 20 years ago? No one spoke. Then Victoria said, too quickly, anyone could have written that. Alessandro did not look away from Elena. Maybe. He placed one finger beside the circled passage. But only someone who used it would know it. Mattered. Elena's hand trembled against the scarf. Sofia slipped her small fingers around her mother's wrist, not pulling her forward, not forcing her to speak, only holding on. Alessandro looked toward Victoria then, and his voice dropped lower. You were not worried about a scarf. You were worried about what was underneath it. Victoria's perfect face remained calm, but the color had left her cheeks. For the first time that night, the woman who had controlled every glance in the room had no graceful answer ready. And Alessandro understood the next question was no longer whether Elena had been there that night. The question was why everyone around him had worked so hard to make sure he never knew. Alessandro did not ask the question in the archive. Not with Victoria watching. Not with the old floor plan spread open like a wound on the table. He rolled the paper back slowly, the way a man might close a door he was not ready to walk through, then looked at Marco. Take Victoria to the blue sitting room. Victoria's smile returned, but only halfway. Alex, there is no reason to separate people as though this is an interrogation. Alessandro slid the silver watch on his wrist back into place. Then it should not feel like one. Victoria looked at Elena, and for a moment there was no charity smile, no polished gentleness, no perfect future wife of a powerful man. There was only warning. Sophia saw it and moved closer to her mother. Alessandro saw Sophia move. That mattered to him more than Victoria knew. He led Elena down the narrow corridor toward the locked family records room. A quiet room with dark wood walls, one long desk, and no windows. Sophia stopped at the doorway because Elena touched her shoulder. Wait right there, baby. Sophia looked frightened, but she nodded. She stayed where a child should stay, close enough to see her mother, far enough not to be pulled into adult secrets. Alessandro left the door half open. He was not trying to trap Elena. He was trying to find out whether the past was finally standing in front of him. Elena stood near the desk with both hands folded over the scarf. The burn mark was hidden again, but nothing in the room felt hidden anymore. Alessandro placed the old emergency plan on the desk, but he did not unroll it. I am going to ask you one question, he said. If you do not know the answer, say so. Elena kept her eyes lowered. Yes, sir. His jaw tightened at the word sir. Sounded wrong now. Too small for what she might have done. The night of the fire, he said. Where was I trapped? Elena did not answer. The silence stretched so long Sophia began twisting the bracelet in her hands outside the door. Alessandro did not push. He knew fear had a shape. He had seen it in men twice his size. He had just never seen it carried so quietly by a woman in a maid's uniform. Elena finally looked at the watch on his wrist, then at the floor. Not your bedroom, she whispered. Alessandro's eyes did not move. The reports said it was my bedroom. The reports were wrong. Her voice trembled, but she did not stop. You were behind the West Library. There was a service door behind the shelves. It should have opened into the garden hall, but someone had locked it from the outside. The room seemed to lose sound. Even the old clock on the wall felt farther away. Alessandro had not told that detail to reporters. He had not told business partners. He had not even told Victoria. As a child, he had screamed behind that locked door until smoke filled the hall and the walls turned orange with reflected light. He remembered one thing before blacking out. Someone saying, "Stay low, little one. Count with me." Alessandro's voice changed. What did you say to me when you found me? Elena's fingers pressed hard into the scarf. I told you to count the steps. His breathing slowed. How many? Elena closed her eyes. 7 to the fallen cabinet. 4 around the glass. 3 to the side door. Then I told you not to look back. Outside the doorway, Sophia stared at her mother as though she was hearing part of her for the first time. Alessandro stepped back from the desk, not because he doubted her now, but because believing her too quickly felt dangerous. A memory could bend around grief. A document could be edited, but a route through a burning house, counted in steps by a terrified boy and the woman who carried him out, was not a story someone guessed. He walked to the small security panel beside the records shelves and pressed 2 buttons. A dim screen flickered on, showing an archive access log. Marco had once installed it after old estate documents went missing. Alessandro scrolled through the entries. Most were routine. House manager, legal assistant, storage clerk. Then one entry stopped him. 3 nights earlier, someone had opened the records room at 2:41 in the morning. The name on the access card was Elena Brooks. Elena shook her head before he could speak. I have never been in this room before tonight. Alessandro believed that part too, which made the screen colder. Someone had used her name to enter the archive before humiliating her in front of a room full of guests. From the hallway, Sophia whispered, Mom was home with me that night. I had a fever. Alessandro turned slowly toward the sitting room where Victoria waited. The private test had answered one question, but opened a worse one. If Elena had told the truth about the night of the fire, then someone inside the house had already begun framing her before the scarf ever touched the floor. The access log changed the room more than the old fire plan had. A scar could be explained away by cruelty. A bracelet could be dismissed as coincidence. A child's memory could be called imagination. But a digital record with Elena's name on it, stamped 3 nights before Victoria's charity reception, meant someone had prepared the humiliation before it happened. Alessandro did not speak for several seconds. He only looked at the screen, then at Elena, then at Sophia standing in the doorway with the ruined bracelet pressed against her chest. Marco, he said at last, pull every file connected to the insurance settlement from the year of the fire. Marco did not ask why. He knew Alessandro well enough to recognize the tone that came before a decision. He moved to the locked cabinet on the east wall, entered a code, and began taking out boxes with faded labels and cracked tape. Victoria appeared at the end of the hallway then, her steps quiet, her expression carefully wounded. Alex, this is unreasonable. You are keeping guests waiting because of an employee and a child's trinket. Alessandro did not turn around. The guests can wait. Victoria's mouth tightened. And what exactly are you hoping to find? He finally looked at her. The part of my life nobody wanted me to read. Marco opened the first box. Old papers slid across the desk, smelling of dust and storage, all organized in the cold language of claims, losses, repairs, and legal summaries. Alessandro went through them quickly at first, then slower when a thin blue folder appeared beneath a stack of property assessments. It had no family crest, no proper label, only a white sticker that said supplemental medical expense. Marco Frounez. This should not be in the insurance archive. Alessandro opened it. Inside was a hospital intake sheet from St. Raphael Medical Center dated the morning after the fire. The patient name had been typed clearly once, then crossed out by hand so hard the ink had torn the paper. But the original letters were still visible beneath the line. Elena Brooks. Sophia leaned forward. That is my mom. Elena covered her mouth with one hand. Not dramatic, not loud, just unable to keep her breath steady. Alessandro turned the page. The report described a woman treated for smoke exposure and burns to her left shoulder and upper back. Attached to it was a small black and white photograph from the emergency room. The woman's face was partly turned away, younger, exhausted, wrapped in a plain hospital blanket. But the scar pattern had already begun forming across her shoulder in the same curved shape that Victoria had exposed in the reception hall. Alessandro sat down slowly, not because he was weak, because the truth had become heavier than standing aloud. You were there, he said. Elena's voice was almost too quiet to hear. Yes, you carried me out. She looked at Sophia, then back at him. I got you as far as the service gate. The firefighters took you from there. I left before your family arrived. Marco pulled another paper from the folder. Alex. His voice had changed. There was a payment request filed under witness relocation assistance. Alessandro looked at the page. The amount was not large for the Moretti family. It was small enough to hide, large enough to silence a frightened woman with no protection. But next to the payment line was a note. Witness declined. Unable to locate, Marco placed his finger beneath another mark. That note was added later. Alessandro turned to Elena. Did anyone offer you help? Elena shook her head. A man came to the hospital. He said if I spoke about that night, people would say I had entered the estate to steal. He said no one would believe me over a Moretti lawyer. Sophia looked up sharply. You never told me that. Elena's face folded with pain, but she stayed calm for her daughter. You were a baby. I wanted you to grow up with something softer than fear. Victoria stepped into the room now. This proves she was injured. It does not prove she saved you. People get hurt around disasters all the time. Alessandro did not answer. He turned the last page in the folder. There, clipped behind the medical report, was a copy of an ambulance transfer note. One line had been circled by an unknown hand. Unidentified female carried minor male survivor to East Service Gate before collapsing. No one moved. No one breathed loudly. Sophia slowly unfolded her hand and placed the burned bracelet on the desk beside the paper, as if even she understood that small things sometimes belonged next to the truth. Alessandro looked from the hospital note to the bracelet, then to the old access log still glowing on the screen. Elena had not disappeared. She had been erased, and whoever erased her had just tried to use her own name to make her look guilty again. Alessandro did not move the hospital file from the desk. He left it open where everyone could see the line that changed everything. Unidentified female carried minor male survivor to East Service Gate before collapsing. For a few seconds, the records room held only quiet breathing, old paper, and the soft ticking of the clock above the shelves. Then Marco slid another box onto the table, this one marked property restructuring, year of estate fire. Victoria looked at the label and said, too softly, "That has nothing to do with her." Alessandro turned a page without looking at her. "Then it should not make you nervous." The box was filled with contracts, insurance forms, renovation bids, and attorney letters written in the careful language people use when they want guilt to sound like paperwork. First, nothing seemed strange. A damaged West Library, a closed East Wing, replacement windows, fire restoration. Then Marco found a repair invoice dated 3 days before the fire, not after it. The invoice listed work on the West Library service door, the same door Elena had said was locked from the outside. Alessandro read it once, then again. Pre-fire security adjustment, he said under his breath.
Elena's face tictened.
Sophia stood beside her mother, holding the burned bracelet in both hands, and whispered, "Is that bad?" Elena placed a hand on Sophia's shoulder. "It means someone changed something before the fire happened." Victoria stepped forward. Old invoices are often misdated. Anyone who has managed an estate knows that. Alessandro finally looked at her. "You have never managed an estate." Her mouth closed. Marco kept searching. Beneath the invoice was a thin folder of insurance correspondence. One letter confirmed a large payout after the fire, larger than the damage report justified. Another listed a transfer of control over several family properties because Alessandro, as a child, had been declared medically unfit to sign anything for years. Alessandro's eyes went cold, not with anger, but with understanding. The fire had not only destroyed rooms, it had moved power, it had moved money, it had allowed men in suits to rearrange a family while a child lay in a hospital bed. Then Sophia noticed something no adult did. She pointed to a small logo at the bottom of one letter, a silver V inside a circle. "That is on Miss Victoria's charity envelopes," she said. Victoria's head turned sharply. "Sophia, that is enough." Alessandro reached for the letter. The logo belonged to Valenti Legacy Trust, a foundation that had existed long before Victoria became his fiancée. On paper, it funded cultural preservation, medical outreach, and private family scholarships. In the files, it had received payments from the same attorneys who removed Elena's name from the hospital record. Marco placed 3 documents side by side. The hospital report with Elena crossed out, the invoice for the locked service door, and the transfer letter to the Valenti Trust. The line between them was not loud. It was worse. It was neat. It was legal-looking. It had survived 20 years because no one had asked why kindness, injury, money, and silence all appeared on the same dates. Victoria folded her hands in front of her dress. "My family handled many foundations. I was 14 when that fire happened. You know I had nothing to do with it." Alessandro did not deny it. That made the room colder. "No," he said. "You did not create the lie." For the first time, Victoria seemed relieved. Then he continued, "You inherited it. And tonight, When Elena walked into this house, you recognized the problem your family had failed to bury. Elena looked down. I never wanted this. I only wanted to work and go home with my daughter. Alessandro looked at her, and something in his face shifted. Not pity. Pity would have been too easy. This was responsibility, and it weighed more. He picked up the access log from the desk and placed it beside the trust letter. Someone used Elena's name 3 nights ago to enter this archive. Someone knew the old files were dangerous. Someone decided to make her look unstable before she could ever be believed. Sofia looked from the papers to Alessandro. Are you going to make them tell the truth? Alessandro closed the file slowly. No, he said. I am going to make the truth strong enough that they cannot talk around it. Victoria's perfect face lost its softness then. Not completely, but enough. Alessandro saw the future she was calculating. Family reputation, legal exposure, charity boards, inheritance contracts, and the quiet empire of favors that had protected her name. He turned to Marco. Pull every camera record, every bank transfer, every attorney message, and every signature connected to this trust. Not tomorrow. Tonight.
Marco nodded.
Elena held Sofia closer, but this time Sofia did not hide her mother's scar. Alessandro looked at the burned bracelet on the desk. Then, at the old documents, and understood the fire had never really ended. It had simply changed into silence, and silence had been passing from one powerful hand to another until a little girl picked up a scarf from the floor and refused to let her mother disappear again. Alessandro did not explode, and that frightened Victoria more than anger would have. Anger could be managed. Anger could be photographed, twisted, whispered about over dinner until it became proof that a man was unstable. But silence was harder to control, especially Alessandro Moretti's silence. He stood in the records room with the fire documents spread across the desk, the burned bracelet beside them, and Elena's crossed-out hospital report under his hand. Then he closed every file one by one, as if locking each piece of truth into place. Marco, he said, no one leaves with a document, a phone, or a story until I know what is real. Victoria lifted her chin. That sounds like a threat. Alessandro looked at her calmly.
No.
It is a boundary. He turned to Elena. Mrs. Brooks, you and Sofia will wait in the library. Mrs. Keller will bring food, water, and a blanket. No one speaks to you without me present. Elena looked startled, almost afraid of being treated carefully. I do not want trouble. Alessandro's voice softened, but only slightly. Trouble already found you. This time it will not be allowed to use your name. Sofia looked up at him, still holding the bracelet. Are we in trouble? Alessandro crouched just enough to meet her eyes without towering over her.
No, Sofia.
You told the truth about something you saw. That is all a child should have to do. Those words stayed with him after Mrs. Keller led Elena and Sofia down the hall. A child should not have had to stand in front of a room full of adults and protect her mother from humiliation. A child should not have known that powerful people could make someone disappear without touching them, simply by crossing out a name. Alessandro went to work. Not like the men his world expected him to be. Not with threats. Not with backroom favors. With records. With timestamps. With signatures. With the kind of evidence no polite smile could charm away. Marco brought in 2 laptops, the security director, and the house attorney, a gray-haired woman named Ruth Bellamy, who had worked for the Moretti family long enough to know when silence became dangerous. I want this handled cleanly, Alessandro told her. Outside counsel. Independent review. If my family name is on something false, remove the protection around it. Ruth studied his face. That may damage the foundation, the estate, and your engagement. Alessandro did not blink. Then they were built too close to a lie. The first break came from the camera outside the East Archive. At 2:41 in the morning, 3 nights earlier, a figure entered with an access card registered to Elena Brooks. The footage was grainy, but the person was taller than Elena and walked with careful confidence. Not like someone lost. Like someone who knew exactly where the blind spots were. Then, at 2:53, the same person left carrying a thin folder under one arm. The face turned briefly toward a mirrored wall, and Marco froze the image. It was the new maid Victoria had personally hired 2 weeks earlier. The one who had stood close enough to Elena during the reception to pull the scarf when Victoria gave the signal. She used Elena's card, Marco said. Or one copied from it. Alessandro turned to the security director. Find who approved her hiring. The answer came in less than 10 minutes.
Victoria Valentí.
The second break came from bank records Ruth requested through the estate's compliance office. A payment had been made from a shell account connected to the Valenti Legacy Trust to the new maid's brother the day before the reception. The memo line said winter staffing bonus. Ruth looked at it and said, "That is not a bonus. That is a receipt trying to dress itself properly." The third break was worse. Marco recovered a deleted voice message from the house system. Victoria's voice was clear, elegant, almost bored. People only believe what they are prepared to see. Make the maid look unstable first, and no one will care what she says later. Elena's name was never mentioned, but it did not need to be. Alessandro listened to the message twice. On the second time, he noticed Sophia standing quietly in the doorway with Mrs. Keller behind her. The little girl had heard enough to understand the shape of it. Not the legal pieces, not the family money, but the unfairness. My mom always says powerful people forget, small people remember everything, Sophia said. Alessandro looked at the documents, the footage, the payments, the recording, and then at the child who had started all of it by refusing to step aside. Your mother is right, he said. Then he turned to Ruth. Prepare the evidence packet. Send copies to independent counsel, the insurance investigator, and the district attorney's office in the morning. Marco looked at him sharply. You want this outside the family? Alessandro picked up the burned bracelet and placed it in a clear evidence sleeve. I spent 20 years protecting the Moretti name. Tonight, I am protecting the truth from it. At the end of the hall, Victoria appeared again, calmer now, as if she had found one last door in a burning house. Alex, she said, before you embarrass everyone, give me one private family meeting. Alessandro watched her carefully. Her voice was steady. Her eyes were not. And he knew then that Victoria, the family meeting began in the same reception hall where Elena had been humiliated less than 2 hours earlier. But the room no longer belonged to Victoria. The champagne glasses had been cleared. The charity banners had been removed. The marble floor still held the faint wet mark where Elena's scarf had fallen after someone stepped on melted snow from the entryway, and Sophia noticed it before anyone else did. She stood beside her mother, close enough to hold her hand, but not in front of her this time. Elena was not standing near the wall either. Alessandro had placed a chair for her at the long table, not behind it, not beside the staff door, but in the center of the room where every Moretti cousin, attorney, board trustee, and household director could see her face. Victoria entered last, dressed perfectly, calm enough to make almost anyone doubt what had happened. She looked around the room and let her eyes rest on Elena with practiced sadness. I asked for this meeting because I believe this family deserves dignity, she said. Tonight became emotional. A child misunderstood. An employee panicked. Alex, you are letting old grief turn coincidence into accusation. Nobody spoke. Alessandro stood at the head of the table with the evidence arranged in neat rows. Not dramatic. Not messy. The first item was the hospital report with Elena's name crossed out. The second was the ambulance note. The third was the old emergency exit plan. The fourth was the pre-fire service door invoice. The fifth was the payment record from the Valenti Legacy Trust. The sixth was the camera image of the new maid entering the archive with Elena's copied access card. The seventh was the recovered voice message. Victoria looked at the table, and for the first time her eyes moved too quickly. Alessandro did not raise his voice. This is not a family argument. This is a record. Ruth Bellamy, the house attorney, opened a folder and read the timeline clearly. 3 days before the fire, the West Library service door was altered. On the night of the fire, a minor male survivor was carried to the East Service Gate by an unidentified woman. The next morning, Elena Brooks was treated at St. Raphael Medical Center for smoke exposure and burns. Her name was later crossed out. Years later, payments connected to the Valenti Legacy Trust continued through legal channels tied to that same file. 3 nights ago, an access card under Elena's name was used to remove documents from the archive. The maid who used that card had been hired by Victoria. A low murmur moved through the room. Victoria lifted one hand. This is all circumstantial. Alessandro nodded once. That is why I did not stop at one piece. Marco pressed play on the recovered voice message. Victoria's own voice filled the room, smooth and certain. People only believe what they are prepared to see. Make the maid look unstable first, and no one will care what she says later. The silence afterward was different from the first silence of the evening. Earlier, people had looked away from Elena because they were uncomfortable. Now they looked away from Victoria because they understood.
Victoria.
Swallowed, then tried one last time. You cannot prove I knew who she was. Sofia looked up at her mother, then at Alessandro. She did not accuse anyone. She simply placed the burned bracelet on the table beside the ambulance note. My mom kept the promise, she said softly. She did not even tell me the whole story. Elena's fingers tightened around the edge of her chair. Alessandro picked up the bracelet with care and turned the broken charm toward the room. Beneath the burned metal, the old Moretti mark was still visible. This belonged to me, he said. I gave it to the woman who got me out of that house. I was a child. I did not remember her face, but she remembered the way out. She remembered the locked door. She remembered the steps. And my family remembered only what was useful. Victoria's face went pale. Not from guilt alone, but from losing the one thing she had trusted more than truth. Control. Alessandro looked at every person in the room before he spoke again. You wanted everyone to see her scar. Now everyone will see what you tried to hide. He turned to Ruth. The engagement is over. Her access to Moretti accounts, foundations, properties, and events is suspended immediately. The evidence packet goes to outside counsel and the district attorney's office as planned. Victoria stared at him. You would expose your own family? Alessandro's answer came quietly.
No.
I am finished letting my family expose everyone else. Elena lowered her head, not in shame this time, but because the weight of being believed after 20 years was too much to hold upright all at once. Sofia reached for her hand, and Elena let her. Around them, the room that had once made a servant invisible now waited for her voice. And for the first time that night, the question was not what Victoria would say next. It was what Elena would choose to do with the truth finally standing beside her. Elena did not answer immediately. For 20 years, other people had decided what her silence meant. They had called it fear, weakness, confusion, bad memory, bad luck, and finally nothing at all. Now, in the same room where her scarf had fallen to the floor, the most powerful people in the Moretti family waited for the woman they had erased to speak. Sofia stood beside her chair, one small hand in her mother's hand, the other resting near the burned bracelet on the table. Elena looked at Victoria first, not with hatred, but with the tired steadiness of someone who had carried the truth longer than anyone should have to carry it. I do not want revenge, Elena said quietly. I want my name put back where you took it from. The room stayed silent. Alessandro lowered his eyes for a moment, and that hurt him more than any accusation could have. Because she had not asked for a mansion, a fortune, or a public display. She had asked for the one thing the powerful had stolen most easily. A record that said she existed. Ruth Bellamy wrote the words down at once. The next morning, the evidence packet was delivered outside the family, just as Alessandro had promised. Not to a cousin, not to a private fixer, not to someone loyal to the Moretti name, but to independent counsel, the insurance investigator, and the district attorney's office. The foundation accounts connected to the Valenti Legacy Trust were frozen for review. The copied access card was logged as evidence. The new maid who had used Elena's name was interviewed by legal investigators and removed from the house staff. Victoria was not dragged out, not shouted down, not turned into a spectacle. That would have been too easy and too small. She lost the thing she had protected most. The clean public mask. Her engagement to Alessandro ended in writing. Her authority over Moretti charities, family events, and property accounts was revoked. Her name was removed from the winter fundraiser before the press release went out. The statement did not call it a misunderstanding. It called it an internal abuse of power under formal review. That was the first justice Elena received. The truth did not have to whisper anymore. The second came 1 week later, when St. Raphael Medical Center amended the old hospital file. Elena Brooks was listed by name as the woman treated after carrying Alessandro Moretti to the East Service Gate during the estate fire. The ambulance note was attached. The altered line was preserved, not hidden, because even the crossing out had become evidence. Alessandro stood beside Elena when she read the corrected record. He did not touch her shoulder. He did not tell her how to feel. He only said, "I am sorry I lived because of you, and then lived beside a lie that buried you." Elena folded the paper carefully. "You were a child," she said. "But you are not a child now." He nodded, accepting both the mercy and the responsibility inside those words. The final gathering was small, not a gala, not a fundraiser, not a performance. It took place in the Moretti reception hall on a clear winter afternoon.
No champagne towers. No charity banners.
Only family members, house staff, legal witnesses, and the corrected documents placed under glass beside the burned bracelet. Elena entered wearing a simple navy dress and the same scarf Victoria had tried to turn into shame. But this time the scarf rested loosely around her shoulders. It did not hide the old burn mark. Sophia walked beside her, holding her hand. When they reached the center of the room, the household staff stood first. Then the family followed. Not because Alessandro told them to, because nobody in that room could pretend anymore. Alessandro announced the Elena Brooks Worker Protection Fund, created to provide legal support, emergency housing, medical care, and independent reporting channels for employees connected to Moretti businesses. Elena was offered a role on its advisory board, not as charity, but as a paid position with authority. She asked for time to decide, and Alessandro said yes. That mattered to Sophia. For the first time, her mother was not being handed a rescue. She was being handed a choice. Later, when the room had softened and the heavy part was over, Sophia touched the edge of her mother's scarf. "Mom," she whispered, "your scar does not look scary anymore." Elena looked down at her daughter. Sophia studied the mark carefully, then said, "It looks like proof." Elena's eyes filled, but she smiled. Alessandro heard it and looked toward the glass case where the burned bracelet rested beneath the light. For 20 years, he had thought power meant keeping a family name untouched. Now he understood it meant making sure the truth could touch it, stain it, correct it, and still be strong enough to stand. Elena left the mansion that day through the front door, not the staff entrance. Sophia walked beside her with her head high, and behind them, in the room where shame had been planned, a scar, a bracelet, and a corrected name remained as proof that the smallest voice in the room had finally made the powerful listen.